Ethan Hayes moved through the jungle with the precision of a seasoned soldier. His heart hammered in his chest, but his steps were light, calculated. The alien drones hummed above him, sweeping the canopy with flickers of blue light that sliced through the thick, suffocating mist. He had barely a few seconds before they would pass over his position again. His breath came in shallow bursts, the taste of copper sharp in his mouth. The weight of his gear pressed against his back, but there was no time to think about discomfort. Only survival. He scanned his surroundings, the dense, twisted vines, the towering trees that clawed toward the sky, and the unnatural silence that had settled over the planet since they landed. This place wasn't abandoned. It was waiting. Waiting for them. The comm unit in his helmet buzzed, breaking the quiet. "Ethan, you copy?" The voice was shaky, unsteady, a voice that didn't belong to a soldier, not anymore. Ethan tapped the side of his helmet, muting the channel. The others were gone. There was no point in listening to their final moments. He had to stay focused, had to keep his mind on the hunt. The jungle was alive, but not with the sound of creatures. Instead, the faint whirring of advanced alien tech filled the air. They weren't here for him out of necessity. They were here for sport. Ethan darted behind a thick tree as the drone passed overhead, its scanners humming as they searched for the telltale signs of human life. His heart pounded, but his hands remained steady as he raised his rifle, tracking the drone's movement. He waited for the faint dip in its trajectory, an imperceptible flaw in their perfect machine precision. In the split second that followed, he fired. The drone sputtered, its lights dimming as it crashed into the underbrush with a hiss. 1 down, 3 to go. He knelt beside the wreckage, carefully prying open the drone's casing. Inside, a blinking node caught his attention, an organic sensor, designed to track human heat signatures. That's how they had been following him, how they'd taken out the rest of his squad one by one. He gritted his teeth and tore the sensor free, smashing it under his boot. Ethan couldn't afford to be careless anymore. The first ambush had been a disaster, their recon team walking blindly into an open field. They hadn't even seen the aliens until it was too late, their sleek, armored figures emerging from the mist with deadly precision. He had watched his friends fall, one after another, and now it was just him. The last one standing. But the aliens had made one critical mistake, they underestimated him. And that would cost them. He slung his rifle over his shoulder and moved deeper into the jungle. The thick, humid air clung to his skin, every breath heavy and labored. Each step forward felt like a step closer to his end, but retreat wasn't an option. Not here. Not now. The trees parted ahead, revealing a small clearing. In the center stood a figure, one of the hunters. Its armor shimmered in the low light, an iridescent sheen designed to blend seamlessly into the surroundings. But Ethan saw it for what it was, a predator that thought itself invincible. He crouched low, sliding behind a fallen log, watching the alien survey its surroundings with mechanical precision. It moved methodically, its weapon primed, its stance confident. Too confident. Ethan pulled a knife from his belt, the cold steel a familiar weight in his hand. He wouldn't waste another shot, not until it counted. Quietly, he crept around the edge of the clearing, staying low and out of sight. The alien's back was turned to him now, its focus entirely on the path ahead. In a flash, Ethan sprang forward, his knife plunging into the exposed joint of the alien's armor. The hunter twisted, letting out a sharp, guttural hiss, but Ethan was faster. He drove the blade in deeper, severing its power core. The alien crumpled to the ground, motionless. He stood over the body, catching his breath. 2 down. The hunt wasn't over, but for the first time since the ambush, he felt a flicker of hope. They thought they could outsmart him, that their advanced technology would guarantee their victory. But they didn't know what it meant to be human. Ethan turned his gaze back toward the jungle. The remaining hunters would come for him now, more determined than ever. But he was ready. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was hunting them. Ethan crouched low in the shadows of the dense jungle, every muscle coiled in readiness. His breath came slow and measured, each inhale bringing the heavy, damp scent of earth and vegetation. Above, the canopy whispered with the sound of alien drones moving overhead, their sensors sweeping the ground for any sign of life. They were close, too close. His heart pounded steadily in his chest, but his hands remained steady as he pulled a makeshift tripwire from his pack. With quick, practiced movements, he secured it between two trees, using the natural foliage to conceal it. The trap was crude, but it would do the job. As he worked, his thoughts raced, piecing together the fragments of his plan. The hunters wouldn't stop. He knew that. They were relentless, driven by a cold, calculated need to prove their superiority. But Ethan had something they didn't: desperation. And desperation made him dangerous. The faint rustle of leaves drew his attention. He froze, narrowing his eyes as the sound grew louder. One of them was close, he could feel it. The air felt different, heavier with the presence of the predator. He gripped his rifle, the cold metal a familiar comfort, and scanned the trees. The alien moved silently through the jungle, its iridescent armor shimmering in the dappled sunlight. It paused near the edge of the clearing, its helmeted head swiveling slowly, scanning the environment with a predator's focus. Ethan waited, muscles tense, his mind racing with calculations. The alien was skilled, cautious, but too reliant on its technology. Its visor swept the area but passed right over the tripwire. Perfect. A sharp crack echoed through the clearing as the alien stepped forward, triggering the wire. Instantly, a weighted net shot upward from the underbrush, wrapping around the alien and pulling it into the air. The alien thrashed, its weapon clattering to the ground as it struggled to break free. Ethan moved swiftly, his rifle aimed at the writhing figure. He fired 3 precise shots, each one punctuated by the mechanical hiss of the alien's suit decompressing. The body went limp, dangling from the net, and Ethan allowed himself a brief exhale of relief. But there was no time to rest. He knew more would come. The hunters worked in packs, and they would soon realize one of their own was missing. He retrieved the alien's weapon from the ground, examining it closely. The design was sleek, ergonomic, built for precision, just like its wielder. But there was something else, something strange. The weapon was cold, unnaturally so, as though it had been designed for a species that thrived in harsher climates. He wondered briefly about the world these creatures came from. It didn't matter now. They were here, and he had to stay ahead of them. Ethan moved deeper into the jungle, his steps careful, his senses heightened. He was alone out here, but that had never bothered him before. Solitude had its advantages: no one to slow him down, no one to watch his back. But now, with the alien threat bearing down on him, a strange thought began to surface. The team he had lost, his fallen squadmates, they hadn't stood a chance. Alone, they were outmatched. But together, maybe. He shook the thought away, refocusing on the task at hand. He couldn't afford distractions, not now. His survival depended on his ability to outthink and outmaneuver the hunters. He had to keep moving, had to stay ahead of them. The jungle grew darker as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the thick underbrush. The temperature dropped, the air cooling as night descended. Ethan's breath fogged in front of him as he pushed forward, navigating the terrain with practiced ease. Suddenly, a flicker of movement caught his eye. He froze, instincts kicking in. Someone, was watching him. Slowly, he turned his head, scanning the trees. There, nestled high in the branches, was a faint glint of metal, a human weapon, partially obscured by the leaves. His heart skipped a beat. He wasn't alone. Ethan's mind raced. Another survivor? It seemed impossible. His squad had been wiped out. He'd heard their final screams through the comms, had watched the drones rip through their defenses. And yet, he approached cautiously, eyes never leaving the weapon. It could be a trap, a lure set by the aliens to draw him out. But something in his gut told him otherwise. As he neared the base of the tree, a voice, a faint, hoarse whisper, called down to him. "Help me!" The words sent a jolt through his system. Human. Definitely human. Ethan looked up, his grip tightening on his rifle. A figure was slumped in the branches, hidden from view. He couldn't see their face, but the desperation in their voice was unmistakable. His mind spun with possibilities. He could leave them, focus on his own survival. But if he left them behind, he'd be doing exactly what the aliens expected, isolating himself, making himself an easier target. No. Not this time. I'm coming up, Ethan called, steeling himself for what lay ahead. The hunt wasn't over, but for the first time in days, he wasn't the only one fighting. Tension rose in his chest, but there was something else too, hope. A dangerous thing to have out here, but something he couldn't quite shake. He started to climb. Ethan hauled himself up the thick trunk, muscles burning with the effort. His heart raced not just from the climb but from the uncertainty of what awaited him above. The voice had sounded weak, strained, but unmistakably human. As his hands found the next branch, his mind whirled with questions. Who could have survived this long? And why hadn't they been hunted down like the rest of his team? Pulling himself onto the final branch, he peered through the dense leaves. The figure slumped against the tree was barely recognizable under layers of dirt and tattered gear. They looked gaunt, a far cry from the hardened soldiers Ethan had served with. He crouched beside them, his eyes quickly assessing the situation. A woman, her dark hair matted and her face streaked with dried blood, looked up at him with dull, exhausted eyes. One arm was held tightly to her side, blood staining the makeshift bandages wrapped around her torso. Her breath came in ragged bursts. "You're alive?" she rasped, her voice barely above a whisper. She coughed, and Ethan could hear the wet rattle in her chest. "Barely," he muttered, his eyes scanning the jungle below. "What happened to your squad?" The woman let out a bitter laugh, the sound cut short by another cough. "Same thing that happened to yours, I bet. We thought we were prepared. Thought we could outsmart them. But we were wrong." Ethan frowned. "Your military?" "Was." She shifted, grimacing at the pain. "Lieutenant Claire Voss, Reconnaissance Division. We came in to scout, gather intel on the hunters. Turns out, they were gathering intel on us." Her words confirmed what Ethan had already suspected. These aliens weren't just randomly hunting humans, they were studying them, learning from every encounter. The thought sent a cold chill down his spine. "They're more than just predators," Voss continued, her voice strained but steady. "They adapt. They're smarter than we gave them credit for. We walked into an ambush. My squad didn't stand a chance." Ethan nodded, his thoughts racing. He had suspected the same thing, but hearing it from someone else made it all the more real. The hunters weren't just here to kill, they were here to learn how to kill better. "Can you walk?" he asked, glancing at her injured side. Voss winced but nodded. "I'll manage. Can't stay up here forever." Ethan extended a hand, helping her to her feet. She swayed slightly, but after a moment she steadied herself. Together they began the careful descent back to the jungle floor, moving as quietly as possible. The canopy above seemed to pulse with unseen danger, every shadow a potential threat. As they reached the ground, Ethan's thoughts turned to the immediate problem. The hunters would come for them soon. His traps had taken out a couple of them, but that wouldn't be enough. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and outmatched. But not outwitted. "We need to move," he said, scanning the trees. "They'll be tracking us." Voss gave a short nod. "I can hold my own," she said, gripping her side. Her voice, though tired, carried a hint of steel. Ethan respected that. Even injured, she wasn't giving up. As they moved deeper into the jungle, Voss spoke again. "These hunters, they're not just here for sport. There's something else going on. We intercepted a transmission before everything went to hell. Something about an experiment." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Experiment? On what?" "On us," she said grimly. "They're testing our limits. Seeing how far they can push us before we break. It's not just about the hunt anymore, it's about control." Ethan's mind reeled. It made sense in a sick, twisted way. The hunters were testing them, seeing how humans adapted under pressure, how they reacted when pushed to the edge of survival. and then they were using that information to become even deadlier. His thoughts snapped back to the present as a sharp sound echoed through the trees. Both of them froze, their eyes scanning the darkening jungle. The whirring of drones cut through the air, closer this time, their sensors sweeping the forest floor. "We need to split up," Ethan whispered. "If we stay together, they'll corner us." Voss met his eyes, understanding the unspoken plan. "We split, we're harder to track. But if one of us falls, we're both dead either way if we don't try." Ethan's voice was firm, but inside, doubt gnawed at him. He didn't like the idea of leaving her, but the odds were stacked too high against them if they stayed together. Voss hesitated, then nodded. "All right. Meet at the old comms tower, half a click north." Ethan nodded. "Stay alive, Lieutenant." She gave him a faint smirk. "You too, Hayes." With that, they parted ways, Ethan slipping into the dense underbrush, his senses sharp. The jungle seemed to close in around him, the shadows growing longer as night approached. Every rustle of leaves, every distant hum of the drones, sent a fresh wave of tension through his body. He had survived this long by staying one step ahead of the hunters. But now, with a new understanding of their intent, the stakes felt higher. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about sending a message. The hunt was far from over. And Ethan wasn't about to let them win. The tower loomed ahead, a skeletal silhouette against the faint glow of the rising moon. Ethan crouched in the underbrush, his breath shallow, heart pounding in his ears. The comms tower, once a vital outpost for his squad, now stood as a grave marker for those who had fallen. He knew the hunters would come. It was only a matter of time. His eyes flickered to the horizon, watching for movement. Voss should have been here by now. The plan had been simple: split up, draw the hunters' attention in different directions, and regroup. But the jungle had swallowed them both, and now, silence hung thick in the air. Every fiber of Ethan's being screamed at him to move, to keep running, but he couldn't leave without knowing if Voss had made it. She'd risked her life to help him. Abandoning her was not an option. A faint rustle in the undergrowth snapped his attention forward. His grip tightened on his rifle as he readied himself for what was coming. Then, a familiar voice broke the silence. "Hayes." Voss emerged from the shadows, clutching her side, limping but alive. Relief washed over Ethan as he lowered his weapon and rushed toward her. "You made it," he said, catching her as she stumbled. "I thought." "I know," she interrupted, her voice hoarse. "But we're not done yet." Ethan scanned her face, noting the dark circles under her eyes and the sheen of sweat that hinted at infection from her wound. She was running on fumes, but she hadn't given up. The fire in her eyes hadn't dimmed, and neither had her determination. "The drones," Voss continued, gasping for breath. "They're scouting the perimeter. They'll be here any minute." Ethan glanced at the tower. "We can use the tower's old transmitter. If we can get a signal out, they'll jam it before it reaches any station," Voss replied, shaking her head. "But we can still use it. Set it to overload. Create an EMP blast. It'll take down their sensors, drones, maybe even fry their tech if we're lucky." Ethan blinked. The plan was reckless, but it was their best shot. "That blast will hit us too. We'll be sitting ducks. Better to fight blind than be hunted like prey," she muttered, pressing a hand to her injured side. "I'll hold them off while you rig the transmitter." Ethan hesitated. She was in no condition to fight, but there was no time for an argument. The hum of drones grew louder, closing in. They had minutes, maybe seconds. "Go," Voss urged. "I'll be right behind you." With a nod, Ethan sprinted toward the tower. His boots crunched against the gravel as he bounded up the stairs two at a time. Inside, the control room was a mess of rusted panels and shattered screens. The tower hadn't been used in years, but the transmitter was still intact. He wiped sweat from his brow, adrenaline fueling his focus as he tore open the console. Below, the sound of gunfire erupted. Voss was engaged with the hunters. Ethan's hands moved with practiced precision, rewiring the system for overload. His mind raced against the clock, every second that passed reminding him of the danger closing in. He glanced out the window. The shapes of the hunters, barely visible in the darkness, were circling Voss. She fired relentlessly, forcing the hunters to keep their distance, but he could see her weakening. Her shots grew slower, more desperate, and the hunters were closing in. Almost there, Ethan whispered, forcing himself to focus. He rerouted the final circuit, and the transmitter buzzed to life. The console glowed, and a countdown appeared on the cracked screen, 60 seconds. He bolted from the room, rushing down the stairs toward Voss. She was still fighting, but she was out of ammunition, swinging her rifle like a club. One of the hunters lunged at her, but she dodged, barely keeping her balance. "Voss!" Ethan shouted, firing at the creature. The hunter staggered back as Ethan rushed to her side, slinging her arm over his shoulder. "I set the blast," he panted, pulling her away from the approaching enemies. "We need to move, now." Together they stumbled toward the edge of the jungle, their breaths ragged. The hunters were closing in, their movements eerily smooth as they stalked their prey. 30 seconds, Ethan muttered, dragging Voss faster. The trees blurred around them as they ran, each second ticking down like a death knell. They reached a small clearing just as the tower behind them exploded in a flash of light. The ground trembled, and a shockwave rippled through the air, sending the hunters sprawling. Ethan and Voss collapsed behind a fallen tree, shielding their faces as the EMP pulse rolled over them. The air was charged with static, and for a moment, everything fell silent. The drones dropped from the sky, lifeless. The hunters, their tech disrupted, scrambled in confusion. Ethan lay on his back, gasping for breath, staring at the stars that had finally pierced the night sky. They had won a small victory, but it wasn't over. The hunters would regroup, adapt. They always did. Voss groaned beside him. "Did we make it?" "For now," Ethan replied, staring at the dark horizon. "But we'll need to keep moving." As the jungle settled into an uneasy quiet, Ethan knew the fight was far from over. But tonight they had survived. And that, for now, was enough.